We spend a lot of time learning, understanding ideas, concepts, frameworks, but there's a gap that most people never cross. The gap between understanding something and actually living it. In the language of Torah, that gap is the difference between Binah and Daas. Binah is when something makes sense. Daas is when what you understand and how you actually live are aligned. This series is about closing that gap, taking ideas that we understand intellectually and turning them into something real, something lived. We'll be working with Torah teachings that approach this with precision and structure. So this is not a series about inspiration. It's a series about process, a structured path from Binah to Daas. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Shema podcast for the perplexed. It is great to be back here with you again. Today's episode is going to be a little different. Rather than exploring one particular Torah topic, I want to share an update about what I've been working on, how this podcast has evolved, where it is headed next, and why I am so excited about the next stage of our journey together. Over the past year and a half, the pace of this podcast has actually been greater than ever. We have explored many different areas of Torah through ongoing series, conversations, and interviews, but during the past few weeks, that frequency of new episodes has slowed. And there's a reason for that. Behind the scenes, I have been completing a project that grew out of much of the work we have done here together. Over the past year and a half, I've been taking ideas developed through this podcast together with many years of personal learning, questioning, and reflection, and trying to synthesize them into a book with a single coherent framework. That work is now complete and is getting near to the point of going into publishing. That book is called From Binah to Daas, Leaving the Exile of the Mind. As the name of the book implies, it has taken many of the ideas that we have discussed here together, but expanded on them and brought synthesis to all those ideas to create one cohesive framework explaining the integrated system of Torah and how it is meant to transform the human being, drawing us towards Dveikus, alignment with Hashem's attributes, and a more loving and responsible relationship with other people. Mitzvah observance and Torah learning are indispensable parts of that process, but when their larger purpose is unclear, they can begin to feel like separate religious activities rather than parts of one coherent system. And the purpose of the book is to bring all those together and provide a detailed architecture of the internal workings of each of us and the framework Torah provides to transform us into who we are meant to become. Now, earlier this year, I taught an essay from the Hasulam to help clarify why understanding this larger structure matters. He explains that becoming more spiritual requires us to understand the systems through which Hashem interacts with us. And that idea stayed with me. It's what propelled a lot of the ongoing learning and development of the ideas in this series and the book. The Baal Shalom teaches that spiritual growth cannot be reduced to having more spiritual feelings or accumulating more religious knowledge. If we want to recognize Hashem's involvement in our lives and respond to Him properly, we need to understand, as much Torah allows us, the order through which He governs creation and relates to us. That does not mean that we can comprehend Hashem himself. We cannot. But Hashem does share with us through his Torah the systems and forces and relationships and patterns through which his will becomes expressed within creation. And this is why I want to break those systems down and study them carefully. For instance, what is the exact relationship structurally between the spiritual and physical worlds? What roles do angels and other spiritual forces serve? How do free will, concealment, resistance, divine providence, prayer, mitzvos, exile, redemptions fit together? How does Hashem's interaction with us create the conditions through which we can recognize him, choose properly, and become more deeply attached to him? Understanding these systems is not the final goal. The goal remains transformation and dvekus. But understanding the structure through which Hashem relates to us may help us recognize his presence more clearly and participate more consciously in the work he has given us. The first stage of the series, From Binah to Daas, examine the human side of that relationship. It provided a framework for understanding the internal faculties Hashem gave us and how Torah teaches us to use them in the work of transformation. As I brought that work toward completion, as it culminated in a book, I expected at first to feel that I had reached the end of this journey, but instead I realized that I had arrived at the beginning of another one. Before I explain where that journey is going, I want to say something about how this podcast itself has changed. When I first began the podcast, it was a lot easier. I would simply come up with a question, find a rabbi to come on and answer the question, and simply spend the first, 10 minutes, 15 minutes framing that question for you, the audience, but then pretty much rely upon the guest rabbi to teach us. Over time, that changed. The other two series I'm running right now, Strive for Truth with Rabbi Michael Cohen and The Power of the Hebrew Months with Rabbi Shlomo Pill, now require extensive learning on my part, as well as the guest. There's a lot of learning and study and ideas to wrestle with and organize, and then propose the framework of that conversation with the guest. That then allows me to test and deepen what I already think I understand. And there's a simple reason for this evolution. And the reason is that the fact is I do not have any time to do a podcast as a separate activity in my life. But I do have time to learn the Torah I believe is imperative to my growth. And then sharing that learning forces me to clarify it, distinguish the sources from my own interpretation, find language that makes the ideas coherent. So the podcast has therefore become less of an interview program and more of a record of the Torah learning I personally need to undertake. And I once thought the series From Binah to Daas, Strive for Truth, and The Power of the Hebrew Months were all separate projects. One thing that became clear when writing the book is that these are actually different expressions of the same pursuit. Understanding how Torah moves from information into perception, character, relationships, choices, and connection to Hashem. That has made the podcast more focused and more niche. And I may lose listeners because of that. And I know I have, just from talking to people. But I've also gained many new listeners along the way. But the reality is that building the largest possible audience is not my goal. My goal is to learn ideas and then share that learning with anyone who wants to join me. There is another aspect of this transition that I want to address directly. Much of the material that we have been covering, and certainly that we will be covering in this next stage, would probably be classified by many people as Kabbalah. And that word immediately raises concerns for some listeners. I've had people tell me they are not interested in Kabbalah, and that's why they stopped listening, because they have heard that a person is not supposed to study Kabbalah until the age of 40 or until they have mastered the entire Talmud Torah. I as well do have a concern about the study of Kabbalah, but it is not primarily that people will encounter ideas that are too abstract or inaccessible. Over the years, I have met Jews who were drawn to Kabbalah while not keeping mitzvos. That is deeply misguided, and quite frankly, it's tragic. The inner dimension of Torah was never meant to become a substitute for the revealed Torah or for the obligations of Jewish life. Its purpose is not to provide spiritual fascination while leaving a person unchanged. It should deepen one's understanding of the mitzvos, reveal how they fit within the larger structure of creation, and strengthen the desire to observe them. So that is not a concern I have about the direction of this series or the episodes I've already produced, because the inner ideas we explore consistently lead back to avodah, character, prayer, and mitzvah observance. We are not studying the architecture of Torah in order to stand outside the system and admire it. We are studying it to better understand our place within it and the actions Hashem asks of us. If anything, seeing how mitzvos fit into the larger architecture gives them greater meaning and creates a more compelling motivation to keep them. But there is another side of the Torah tradition that also needs to be understood. The sources themselves describe a time when the inner dimension of Torah would become increasingly revealed because it would be necessary for the final stages of Jewish history. I believe that helping people understand this inner structure while continually connecting it back to mitzvos and avodah is part of what this podcast can contribute to this unfolding process. One prophecy in the Zohar we have mentioned before on multiple occasions, but I'll repeat here, interprets the Torah's reference to the 600th year of Noah's life as a pattern for the 6th millennium of history. It states that in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, the gates of wisdom above and the fountains of wisdom below would open, preparing the world to enter the 7th millennium. And we have discussed that the year in which that equates to was 1840, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the time of the Baal Shem Tov, bringing the deeper meanings of Torah down and in a way that the common person like me could understand. This passage from the Zohar does not necessarily say that every person must learn advanced technical Kabbalah, but it does describe the final period of history as a time of unprecedented revelation, both in the higher wisdom of Torah and in the wisdom discovered within the physical world. The Tikkun Zohar makes even a more direct connection between the revelation of the inner Torah and redemption. It teaches that because Israel is destined to taste from the tree of life, identified there with the book of the Zohar, they will leave exile through it with mercy. The important point is not merely that studying Zohar is spiritually beneficial. The passage connects exposure to the inner dimension of Torah with the manner in which Israel will leave exile. A second passage in Tikkun Zohar speaks much more sharply. It actually criticizes an approach that turns Torah into something dry by stripping it of its inner wisdom and treating Torah as though it contains only its outward meaning. That passage must be handled carefully. It is not a rejection of halakha, Gemara, or the revealed dimension of Torah, God forbid, and it is not permission to bypass the body of Torah in order to pursue only its hidden teachings. Its argument is that Torah becomes incomplete when its body is separated from its soul. There's also a deeply personal reason I refuse to approach Judaism as though the task is simply to learn how to perform the mitzvos correctly or to study Torah as an academic exercise. My entire journey as a Baal Teshuvah began with a question, which was, how did my great-grandparents, or perhaps my great-great-grandparents, stop being Torah observant after generations of Jews have preserved this way of life going all the way back to Mount Sinai? Like, really, what happened here? And I'm not alone. I mean, how could a family remain connected to Torah across so many generations, and then within 1 or 2 generations, allow that connection to totally disappear? So many of my listeners that are now my friends, I know, are asking the same question as they strive to rebuild their Torah observance. But when I eventually moved into a Torah observant Jewish community, I began to see part of the answer firsthand, because I saw Jews who had been raised observant, but who were walking away because they had no real understanding of why they were doing what they were doing. They knew what to do. They may have known when to do it, how to do it, but too often no one had helped them understand what the mitzvos were forming within them and how the different parts of Torah fit together, or what all of it was ultimately meant to accomplish. So when religious life is experienced only as a series of instructions and obligations and inherited behaviors, it can become difficult to carry once the surrounding community or family structure no longer reinforces it. A person may know the mechanics of observance without understanding its destination. This does not mean that everyone who leaves observance does so for the same reason, but I have seen enough to understand the danger of a religious practice becoming disconnected from its meaning and its destination. That is why I need to study not only what Hashem asks us to do, but what those actions are meant to form within us and how the different parts of Torah fit together. The Baha'u'llam develops this idea systematically in his introduction to the Zohar. He distinguishes between the inner and outer dimensions of Torah and argues that when the inner dimension is treated as secondary or insignificant, the external and material forces of the world become dominant. When the inner Torah is elevated, understood, and given its proper place, the inner spiritual dimension of Israel, and ultimately of humanity, is elevated as well. For the Baal Salam, the dissemination of Penimius HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, is not merely an interesting educational project. It is part of the spiritual process through which redemption occurs. So this project will not teach mystical techniques or attempt to manipulate spiritual forces or present sensational ideas simply because they sound cool. The goal is I want to understand carefully and from authentic Torah sources the architecture that Torah describes. These questions may belong to the inner dimension of Torah, but they are all essential questions on how a Jew understands life, avodah, free will, and relationship with Hashem. That is the direction in which this podcast has been moving. The Power of the Hebrew Month series, the Strive for Truth series, From Binah to Daas, and now Stage 2, are all attempts to understand the inner structure beneath the Torah we learn and observe. The goal is not mystical knowledge for its own sake. The goal is to understand more clearly how Hashem relates to us, how the systems He created shape our avodah, and how all of Torah moves the human being toward transformation, love, and devekus. Up to this point, From Binah to Daas is primarily examining the internal process of transformation, how the faculties Hashem gave us can become properly ordered so that Torah moves from understanding into lived reality. But that work does not take place in a neutral environment. We encounter concealment, temptation, confusion, resistance, and spiritual forces that Torah describes as assisting, testing, or obstructing our growth. That raises the question behind stage 2 of this series. What kind of world did Hashem create in which transformation must occur? Why is there a physical world, and why is Hashem's presence concealed within it? What are the Yetzirah, angels, prophecy, spiritual forces, and the ministers of nations? How do prayer and mitzvos affect realities we cannot see? And how does the structure of history move toward redemption and Mashiach? These may initially sound like separate subjects, but they are parts of one integrated system. That realization is the foundation of what I am calling From Binah to Daas, Stage 2, the architecture of creation. Stage 1, explore the internal architecture of the human being. Stage 2 will examine the architecture of the world in which that human being is called upon to grow. I also want to explain how the new stage of the podcast will work. I am not beginning with a completed map or a theory I intend to prove. Each episode will investigate one piece of the larger question, beginning wherever possible with Tanakh and Chazal, and then examining how later Torah authorities understood and developed those sources. We will distinguish between what a source explicitly states, how it has been interpreted, and where we are attempting to understand how different ideas fit together. Sometimes an episode may produce a clear answer. At other times, it may reveal a disagreement or uncover a deeper question. I do not intend to force this research into a timetable or a predetermined book outline. I want the Torah sources themselves to shape the project. Over time, the episodes may begin to form a larger picture and perhaps, eventually, another book. But you will be joining me while that picture is still developing, not only after the work is complete. My hope is that this series will help us see Torah less as a collection of separate teachings and obligations and more as one integrated system, encompassing the spiritual and physical worlds, the human soul and body, free will and resistance, prayer, mitzvos, and our relationship with one another. The goal of understanding that system is not knowledge for its own sake. It is to understand more clearly the task Hashem has given us and the path through which the human being moves toward transformation and Dveikus. I am deeply grateful to everyone who has learned with me throughout this journey. The ideas we have explored so far together helped me give birth to my book, From Binah to Daas, Leaving the Exile of the Mind. Now, even as this first stage moves towards completion, a new field of questions is open before us. Beginning with the next episode, we will examine the architecture of creation one piece at a time. And I'm excited to see where the Torah sources lead us. Thank you as always for joining me and for learning with me. I will see you the next time on the Shema podcast for the perplexed.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast.